Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, you've described the prosecution of Roger Stone as righteous. That's clearly something that the President and I disagree with you on. I would suggest that perhaps the prosecution of Andrew McCabe, who lied 4 times, thrice under the penalty of perjury, would be more righteous. I would suggest to you that uncovering the criminal conspiracy that existed where people in our own government were trying to convince intelligence agents and operatives around the world to destabilize our elections and to discredit our president would perhaps be more righteous. But as we sit here today, I don't think that Mr. Stone or Mr. McCabe or any of those other folks are killing anyone or burning down our buildings. And so I'd like to focus our effort on the most acute need I believe our country has. You've recently said that you believe Antifa to be a terrorist organization. What's your basis for that belief?
I'm not sure I said terrorist organization. I said we're investigating it as domestic terrorism. But Antifa, there are a number of violent extreme groups in the United States, and they're across the spectrum. Antifa is heavily represented in the recent riots. That's not to say they're the only group involved. And they have been identified as involved in a number of the violent mob actions that have taken place around the country.
And Mr. Attorney General, I saw the chairman of the Judiciary Committee recently say that Antifa is a myth, that their involvement in this violence isn't something that is real. What's your reaction to the chairman?
Well, I don't think it's a myth. Antifa can be best thought of, I think, as a umbrella term for what is essentially a movement comprised of loosely organized groups around the country. In some areas of the country, there are a number of groups, and there are sort of centers of activity. The groups, as I say, are loosely organized, but they are definitely organized. But since they have an anarchic temperament, they don't get along very well with each other. So I'm not suggesting it's a national organization that moves nationally. They tend to get organized for an event, and there's a lot of organization right before an event occurs, but we see a lot of the organization during the mob violence.
And that is a really important distinction when determining how to apply particularly our RICO laws to an organization like this. If Antifa is merely something that inspires people to go out and commit violence, that strikes me as legally distinct from Antifa being an organizing influence to assist people in committing crimes. One question I get from my constituents as they watch the death and violence and disruption and chaos in Seattle and in Portland and in other places is whether or not there's a risk that could metastasize to other areas of the country. Have you given consideration to the risk that might befall other American communities if the Department of Justice were not to take action to protect and preserve federal property in places like Portland?
Yes, absolutely. We are concerned about this problem metastasizing around the country. And so we feel that we have to, in a place like Portland, where we don't have the support of the local government, we have to take a stand and defend this federal property. We can't get to a level where we're going to accept these kinds of violent attacks on federal courts.
And if you did what my Democrat colleagues were asking, if you merely abandoned that federal property, allowed it to be overrun, allowed the people inside to be harmed, is it your view then that Antifa and other violent people engaged in these acts would simply stop, would simply accept that as their sole victory? Or is it your expert opinion, having dealt with a number of law enforcement and criminal cases in your legal career, that they wouldn't stop, that they would go to the next town, to the next community, and potentially inspire more violence?
There's no doubt in my mind that it would spread.
And what comfort can you give Americans in my district and around the country that you will stop this, that you will stop the burning and destruction of federal property, and that you will give confidence to regular Americans that they can go out in the streets without the risk of this terrorism?
Well, as you can see in Portland, we have a relatively small number of federal officers who have been withstanding this for almost 2 months. It's a great strain, but we cannot just stand aside and allow the federal court to be destroyed.
Thank you for your service and for your great work. I yield back.